this seems to be a propitious day to do this because the president was in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and talking about gun violence and adamantly saying he wants to make sure that there are no more assault weapons that are being used, and offering to support a weapons ban. My talk today, this PowerPoint presentation, as John mentioned, is based upon some material from my book, Weaponized Whiteness, which came out in 2021 on Haymarket Books. I think this is kind of an appropriate picture to start with, to just give a little bit of background. The Pew research from the period 2013-2014 said 61% of U.S. Adults who own guns are white men, and that's more than twice their percentage of the adult population. And the vast majority of those white men who own guns are over 35 and self-identified as conservative Republicans. Although what conservative Republicanism means anymore is a matter of dispute. I would like to say that these gentlemen standing in front of this White House are representative of what we could call the vigilante wing of the Republican Party. Remember, the Democrats used to have a vigilante wing in the segregation South, and now it's switched over to the Republicans. So let's get started. Now, what I want to try to do is to provide a historical context for understanding why it is that it's so difficult to really have even common sense gun reform. I'm going to talk specifically about how deeply embedded this whole gun culture and gun violence is in the United States, and link it in particular with systemic racism. There's certainly other ways of looking at how gun violence plays out. You could look at toxic masculinity. You can look at the history of the frontier. You can look at the whole issue of the rights revolution, that sort of issue. But I'm going to look more at the question of systemic racism. And what I want to do is to start by talking about a couple of interpretive lenses. And I want to make clear that the reason why it's so difficult to really deal with the whole context of gun violence is that it often only comes down to the question of getting rid of certain kinds of weapons or doing background checks. But it's a broader topic. As Langman and Lunsko point out, gun ownership, individually as well as collectively, became an essential part of American character and identity. And that's important. The degree to which white supremacy is deeply embedded in the history of this country means that that character, that identity, and the role of guns in particular is essential. And of course, when we go back to that period when in the early American colonies, right up through the American Civil War, there was massive gun control. Fundamentally, people of color couldn't own guns, especially in the South. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. The other element is that I think is very important is that guns in particular have become part of a kind of mythic story of the United States. And I'll talk more about that when it comes to the discussion of the Second Amendment. So what I mean by that mythic quality is that it is ahistorical. It's not based upon a historical record. It's based upon a kind of ahistorical sensibility. And that's particularly important because all of the hysteria which the right-wing and right-wing politicians have been ramping up around critical race theory and around the teaching of certain kinds of history is based upon trying to get at the meaning of the past and the way in which that past has been mythologized. So one of the important lenses, I think, that's really significant for a better understanding of U.S. history is settler colonialism. Now, the United States, of course, isn't the only country in the world that had white settler colonialism. You know, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, all of which had elements of settler colonialism. But as Walter Hickson points out, American history is the most sweeping, most violent, and most significant example of settler colonialism in world history. American settler colonialism evolved over the course of 3 centuries, resulting in millions of deaths and displacements, while at the same time creating the richest, most powerful, and ultimately the most militarized nation in the world. That's the kind of history that is a threat to the very people who are opposed to wrestling with what is the legacy of this violence. And remember, back in 1967, Martin Luther King talked about the United States as the most violent country in the world. And he was tapping into this history and tapping into what I'll be talking about mostly, that is the role of war, which was one of his 3 evils, as you remember, in that speech, triple evils, and also the history of policing, which I think is also very important when it comes to white supremacy, weaponized whiteness. Now, another element of this is to better understand what we mean by the racial state or systemic racism. And I'll just extract one of these quotes that I've by the sociologist Joe Fagan. Systemic racism involves a diverse assortment of racist practices. The unjustly gained economic and political power of whites, the continuing resource inequalities, the rationalizing white racist frame, and the major institutions created to preserve white advantage and power. That has a long, long history, and it's still something we need to wrestle with. How that then informs American gun culture and what I call weaponized whiteness, I think is evident in just some of these other studies that I've drawn upon. As Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz says in her wonderful book called Loaded, which is a history of the Second Amendment, entitled White Nationalism, Racialized Dominance, and Social Control Through Violence. That's part of that gun culture legacy. The gun in America reeks of white power. As a nation, we continually need to justify how and why we use the gun, only to pretend that we do not know how the gun functions to further racial oppression, economic disparity, and war. So let me begin with one of the greatest myths that still persists and allows people, even those who aren't really advocates of guns, to kind of lapse into. And this is the Second Amendment. And I would highly recommend the most recent work by Carol Anderson called The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. And she does a great job of looking at the whole long history. But first and foremost, when we think about the Second Amendment, normally the way in which it comes about through the mythology, right, is the mythology is it was put in place to protect against governmental tyranny, and we never want that to happen again, and that's why we all believe in the Second Amendment. That's BS. The Second Amendment, crafted by a member of the slaveocracy, James Madison, was specifically crafted based upon the need for Southern states to retain what were their state militias. They were very concerned about the federal government taking over their state militias, particularly if the federal government was committed to abolition. So the hidden history of the Second Amendment, as Carl Bogus talks about, is the militia remained the principal means of protecting social order and preserving white control over Black population. And as Carol Anderson points out, the second was designed and implemented to abrogate and deny the rights of Black people. And this is essential. So when those of us who are gun abolitionists, when we call for eliminating the Second Amendment, what we're talking about is understanding its real history, not its mythologized history. We don't want to take anybody's rights away. but we're talking about ending the legacy of systemic racism, ending the way in which weaponized whiteness has been wielded against people of color. All right. So let's take those two areas where I look at gun violence and the rise of white supremacy, which of course is baked into the history of this country, both in settler colonialism and in war capitalism. And it's part and parcel, as everybody knows, of the Constitution of the United States. Everything from the Electoral College and the 3/5 clause, the Senate, et cetera, and the filibuster. So part of what we're looking at when we consider the ways in which gun violence has been part of weaponized whiteness is it's been the story of that settler colonialism, of fighting the wars internally in the United States as it expanded its settler colonial reach. And this is, of course, about exterminating the native peoples. The first of those wars of extermination was the Pequot War in 1637. This was the Puritans in New England. And what they established as a way of understanding why native peoples needed to be exterminated was passed down over generations. And the main argument was these were heathens, they were savages. We came to civilize this country, we came to Christianize this country, and therefore they needed to be exterminated. Even some, of course, the great American heroes like George Washington here pointing to his surveyor map over the dead body of a native person. Washington, as Colin Calloway makes clear in his history of the Indian world of George Washington, he oversaw an aggressive expansion that created a new racially defined empire, a nation of free white citizens that excluded Native Americans as it also excluded African Americans. And in that sense, Native Americans were destroyed by the process of accumulation by dispossession. And Africans, people of African descent, were brutally possessed in the process of accumulating wealth and capital. All of this continued throughout the 18th and 19th century. Among the most significant components of this was the move of Indian removal, the whole decade of the Trail of Tears, overseen by particularly Andrew Jackson, a big hero of Donald Trump. And here's Jackson talking about the need to move the Choctaw, the Creek, the Cherokee. And it should be made clear that many of these native peoples living in what was then southeastern United States, some of them even had enslaved people of African descent. So they were trying to play by the so-called rules of white supremacy. That didn't matter when it came to taking over their lands. That didn't matter when it came to expelling them. That didn't matter when it came to pressing them across the Mississippi River and in the process leading to thousands and thousands perishing because of this brutal pogrom, ethnic cleansing. And throughout the 19th century, again, it becomes this trope going back to the Pequot War convention that was used to appropriate this land and to practice projecting on to Native people the idea of being savages. And in her study, Jane and Lati, of what the U.S. governments did in trying to destroy the Apache population of Southwest United States in a 30-year war. As she points out, the United States was born, manufactured, and maintained through conquest and war. And of course, again, one of the most brutal elements of that, and I apologize for some of these gruesome pictures, but I think it's a reminder of how gruesome our past was and the need not to ever bury this by falsifying or mythologizing history. And the Wounded Knee Massacre is, I think, particularly important because of what it said about the way in which even peaceful Native peoples were operating. On the Lakota Pine Indian Reservation in South Dakota, the U.S. sent troops to disarm Lakota and break up the ghost dance. Now, the ghost dance was a kind of revitalizing movement of Native peoples, hoping for the return of buffalo and for maybe the white men not bothering them as much. But the troops fired on a peaceful group, killing over 300 men, women, and children. Some of the soldiers got medals for meritorious service. It wasn't until 1990, 100 years later, where the Congress passed a resolution expressing deep regret for the massacre. This was going on even as President George H.W. Bush engineered a military invasion of Panama, leading to another massacre of some 3,000 poor Panamanians. So the ironies always abound in U.S. history. And just to show how this attitude was so deeply pervasive about the exterminationist vision of how Native people should be dealt with. Of all people, L. Frank Baum, which that name should be familiar, right? The Wizard of Oz guy. Well, at that time, he was he was writing for the Aberdeen, South Dakota newspaper, and as part of his column, he said, after the Wounded Knee Massacre, our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians. I guess that wasn't the Kansas that Dorothy was part of, but or in Oz. So this internal war making and the use of weaponized whiteness against people of color would become part of a global effort to establish America on the global stage, right beginning at the end of the 19th century with the US war in the Philippines. And this is a graphic from Harper's Weekly, and you can see how Native peoples, Filipinos, are visualized, what kind of images they have of these, again, savages, right, of Oriental-looking faces. In fact, Indian was the racial epithet for Filipinos preferred by the high command, whereas the second most popular epithet of many of those white soldiers fighting in the Philippines was the N-word. This continued throughout the 20th century of U.S. war making, of carrying it out against people of color, and of incredible and vicious massacres, some of which we still haven't been able to fully comprehend, including the My Lai Massacre of March 16th, 1968, when 504 women and children were killed by U.S. soldiers. This incredible massacre was just part of a whole history of atrocities in Southeast Asia. There were people who stood up against it. There were people in the United States who opposed the war. There were soldiers who opposed the war. There was even one incredible helicopter pilot in My Lai who set down his helicopter and told his gun crew to fire on any American that fired on these innocent Vietnamese. So it's not as if this has been at all uncontested, but it still remains a way in which we mythologize those so-called warriors. And this, even up to the present day, in the film American Sniper, where you have Clint Eastwood film in 2014, based upon the autobiography of Chris Kyle, who was a Navy SEAL who was boasted of having killed 250 people during his 4 deployments in Iraq. In the film, Eastwood softens it up. He makes, the Iraqis as some really evil people that need to be eliminated. But as far as Chris Kyle was concerned, he wanted to even kill more Iraqis who we referred to, and here comes that word again, raghead savages. So while some policy has changed, while some of our efforts to underscore and reveal the white supremacist threads throughout American war making and gun violence, some of that still remains. So that's turning from gun violence in war. I want to turn to gun violence in policing. And again, it's important to understand where policing came from. Essentially, this was about establishing slave patrols in the South, and the guns and slavery were intimately associated with each other. All slave raiding relied on guns, and all slave holding relied on armed repression. This persisted even though the South and slaveocracy was defeated. Nonetheless, white supremacist gun violence continued, particularly throughout the Reconstruction. And here you see the rebirth of the KKK in this period, the emergence of the White League. And there are scores of massacres that were only beginning to deal with it, beyond what happened into the 20th century with Tulsa, with East St. Louis, back into the 19th century, from whence came this institutionalized gun violence. And it persisted into the 1920s. The Border Patrol was actually set up in the 1920s, just as the gates to the United States were being shut by this nativist response. And the KKK, a second KK, was emerging as a powerful political force, not just in the South, but throughout the United States. In fact, where I am now in Detroit, in 1924 mayoral election, the KKK candidate won, only to be disqualified on a technicality. So the Border Patrol in particular drew from the KKK. One of the reasons why they were so viciously opposed to people of color. This continues both in police forces, not only in the South, but also in vigilante violence that occurs. The vigilante violence that strikes down Medgar Evers, and if any of you know the song by Bob Dylan, Only a Pawn in Their Game, he also has another tune, Only with God on Our Side, that provides a certain history of all of this. Medgar Evers was the leader of the NAACP in Mississippi, very dynamic leader who was shot and killed by Byron Della Beckwith, who was tried in 1964. Both trials, and the later trial ended in a hung jury. I talk about what finally brought him to justice and finally got Beckwith to prison. It took a long while. I talk about that in my book, Weaponized Whiteness. And here is one of the great godmother of the modern civil rights movement, Ella Baker, who really helped to birth the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Until the killing of Black men, black mother's sons becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens. Now, maybe we can begin to see some differences when Ahmaud Arbery is found guilty, when that kind of slaying of black men. But we know that is not always the case, that vigilante violence continues because it can continue because of laws that are passed, like stand your ground gun violence. That's what helped George Zimmerman be found not guilty after having murdered why am I blanking on his name? The young teenager in Florida who Obama said, I could imagine him being like me when I was younger.
It wasn't.
Okay. It'll come. So the evidence of stand your ground suggests not only that the law has contributed to the increase in homicide, but also it is utilized in ways that exacerbate racial disparities. According to one study, when the shooting victim is black and the shooter is white, the case is 281% more like to be ruled justifiable homicide than when people are of the same race. This racist violence continues, and you can go through the list. As Kenga Diamata Taylor says, it's no exaggeration to say that the men and women in blue patrolling the streets of the U.S. have been given a license to kill and demonstrated a consistent propensity to use it. More often than not, police violence, including murder and attempted murder, is directed at African Americans. And here's, unfortunately, the list that still goes on. And of course, for those of you in Cleveland, this tragedy of the murder of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, for which the cop who ran out of the car gave no warning whatsoever and shot Tamir Rice down, he has not been brought to trial, right? There is much restorative justice which is needed. But it's being taken on. It's being taken on in the aftermath of what happened in Ferguson, and how what you see now is a combination, as you can see, among the police of them being militarized. In fact, the Pentagon had been giving a lot of police former equipment from the Pentagon. This was a law that was passed in the 1990s, and over 11,000 local police agencies received over 3.4 million orders of Pentagon equipment. And when Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri, and there was immediate mobilization on the part of that community, they were met with this kind of militarized policing. But those Ferguson protests were so strong that the Obama administration had to begin to try to assert some oversight onto the militarization. And of course, the Justice Department provided a ruling, or at least did a study that indicated that what was going on in Ferguson with the kind of policing, people were being arrested for bad stoplights, for other kinds of problems, and then those would be compounded. And these, of course, were mostly people of color. But the fight back was unleashed, from not only Ferguson, but the movement of Black Lives Matter, which not only was part of the African American community, but you saw thousands, tens of thousands, actually millions of people being mobilized because of what happened, and particularly in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. These are the kinds of movements that challenge not just gun violence and weaponized whiteness, but challenge the whole issue of white supremacy. One of the other elements is March for Our Lives, and this incredible mobilization led by the kids of Parkland. Here in the middle is Emma Gonzalez, who helped to mobilize marches around the country that did get some modicum of gun reforms passed. But this is, their agenda was a lot more militant than what was eventually adopted. But one of the things I think you see is that they reached out, these kids from Parkland reached out to African-American schools around the country. This was a real multiracial alliance against gun violence and for a peace plan for a safer America. Another element of that mobilization against gun violence, maybe not as conscious of the links between weaponized whiteness and gun violence, was Moms Demand Action. And again, we can see how all of this is mobilized and continues to be mobilized around issues of gun violence. Now, I wanted to turn, having talked a little bit about the historical elements, the long history of how war making and policing have played into how gun violence becomes reflective of weaponized whiteness. I want to just go back to some statistics again, some that the president didn't quote today, but he certainly made a strong appeal for at least banning assault weapons. These are the 10 civilian gun-owning countries. The United States is far in advance of any country in the world. In fact, there are more guns in this country than there are people. We're talking about 300 and some million people, and we're talking about over that number of guns. By the way, the small people who are multiple gun owners, they represent only 5% of the population. So, whenever there are polls that are done about so-called common sense gun solutions, the overwhelming majority is for it. But gun manufacturers who have a big lobby and particularly strong among the Republican Party and the NRA, they make sure that the kind of banning of assault weapons or background checks, that's going to be very hard to do. And part of it is how unregulated the proliferation of weapons is. I mean, and it's not surprising, this overwhelming sea of whiteness that you see here at these gun shows. These gun shows are unregulated, hardly have any kind of background checks that are connected to them. There are thousands of gun shows around the country, and this was a place where often you'll see these really vicious white supremacist literature being sold, like the Turner Diaries, which is a vicious anti-Semitic white supremacist book. And of course, in gun-related deaths, there's no comparison. The United States is way beyond the rest of the world. And of the 40,000 people who die each year of gun violence, more of them die by their own hand, by suicide. And a lot of those a lot of those are white people. And Jonathan Metzl's book of Dying of Whiteness really focuses in on how it is that people, even though they've lost loved ones, still somehow are mesmerized and mystified by the idea of needing to have guns. And part of it, as I argue, goes back to that long history of the ways in which it's so much built into identity and character structure in the United States. And this is such a surprising number, right? If you look at the period from 1968 to now, about how many people have died of gun violence in the United States, and how many people have died from all wars. Now, this is just US citizens, because if we had to add in how many people were murdered in US war making, that would be in the tens of millions. So, but you can see this kind of comparison. It's astounding. It's just astounding. And now we need to also contend with how domestic terrorists like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, the MAGA crowd, all of those who are the vigilante wing of the Republican Party, these are the domestic terrorists, which is why those Republicans are freaked out by the FBI when the FBI can start talking about domestic terrorism, particularly its white supremacist operation. This is, and it's only getting worse until we really not only contend with, as we've seen in places like Buffalo, New York, we need to really rethink not only gun policy, but policing and war making and what that means.